So, someone suggested that I do a movement video with a game that I could actually get. Look over on the right side there, a show keys element on the HUD. So you can see exactly what I'm doing with my keyboard and mouse. So, first of all, this is not CPMA, it's slightly different. It's sort of a clone, but it has a few differences, so I'm going to cover those before I get into the rest of it. First of all, what I'm going to describe circle jumping, in this game, it's a lot weaker, and you can't get as fast as you can get in CPMA. Second of all, this game has something called dashing, where you can press a button and get a high speed in a straight line that you're looking in. And it also keeps the velocity that you have pretty roughly. It might change it very slightly, but it's pretty much the same velocity. It's just rounding errors and stuff. So, in first-person shooters, typically, or almost always rather, when you change the direction that you're moving, you have an acceleration curve. Like when I approach my speed, you'll see it scales up, and then when I let go, it scales down. And there's a couple games that don't work like this, like Fallout 3, but pretty much anything that feels good to play is gonna work like this. It's gonna have an acceleration curve and a speed limit somewhere. Now, some games use drag on the ground in order to cap the speed of the player. So instead of hitting the max speed, you will slowly approach it and get closer and closer and never quite get it. I'm pretty sure Minecraft is like this, but I'm not sure. So let's get on with it now. So when you move in a straight line, you hit your speed cap, right? But then in so many games, the speed cap is applied in the direction where your movement keys are pointing on the ground, rather than the direction that your character is moving. So in the direction you're pointing your keys, you can be moving at the max speed, but you're going off to the side a little bit. So your actual movement vector as a whole, the actual inertia that you have, completely is above the speed limit. And if I try to jump across this at the normal speed limit, I just can't do it. But if I circle jump, it's perfectly fine, because I had a higher actual velocity when I left the ground. And sure, my direction was a little wrong, but it lets me actually get that far across the ledge. And there's a couple tricks you can do it in different games. Like sometimes, like Counter-Strike 1.6, when you do this, you just hold forward, and that's stronger than doing it with diagonal keys after moving forward. But in CPMA, Quake 3 CPMA, the mod, it's easier to start moving forward and then do a diagonal twist. I don't know how that is in Warsow because I don't play it enough, but it's almost the same game, and I'm going to use it to describe some air mechanics. So, because people... So, like Quake World, Quake 1, they wanted to make it so people could get up ledges that they wanted to jump up. So what they did was, they have a little bit of air control, but it's like limited at 30. So if you're air stalled when you jump, you can unair stall yourself when you get over the ledge. And that's really important, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to climb up ledges so smoothly. And there's a couple other ways to do it, but I like this one. Not just because it lets you do funny stuff in the air that I'm going to show in a moment, but also because it's very simple. It's not some weird, like, jumping over, crawling over animation mechanic. It's just a very simple, intuitive piece of physics. You can play the game and get a very, very good feel for it. So now I'm going to show how that speed cap in the air of 30, you can see down here my speed. Like, it's a 30 speed cap, but again, it's only applying in the direction I'm pointing my keys in 3D space. So if I turn, now I'm slightly moving off to the side. Not to the side, but I'm slightly moving forward and backward because it's applying the speed cap to the side, but it just accelerated diagonally to this. So, like, you have a bunch of really tiny triangles of movement additions off to the side, and eventually it can just spiral out of control, and that's exactly what it does. So, like, I can go like this, and now I'm moving in a spiral. And you can accelerate up to ridiculous velocities like this because there's no air friction in these games. I know Q2 World has air friction, and it has a different air movement model with a higher acceleration than like Quake 3 and stuff, but That's not important to know, but it is important to know that not all games are the same. For example, by the time of Quake 3, they decided to change the air movement system so that it didn't have this 30 speed cap, but you can see, like, I'm pretty much always at that cap. The acceleration value is really high underneath that cap. So by the time of Quake 3, they decided to raise the cap a lot and base it on how fast you're moving, and then make it so that the acceleration value itself is really low. And I can't show you the acceleration value itself because this game does weird things with moving forward and backward in the air because it's based on CPMA, and CPMA did that. But that's not that important to know. Just, like, know that it's a thing. So here I'm holding diagonally, and the speed cap is 320, but now the speed cap's 470 because that's how it works in Vanilla Quake 3, and this has the Vanilla Quake 3 air movement settings when you're using diagonals, and it has the Quake 1 Quake World settings when you're using left and right. By the way, games like Counter-Strike and Team Fortress 2 all use the Quake World style of air control. So don't worry about that, just worry about these if you're playing those games. But I'm making this video for people who want to play CPMA. So remember that circle strafe thing on the ground where you have your speed cap and you can, like, jump it? Well, it turns out that one of the reasons that in CPMA it's so good to go diagonal when you do a circle jump is because then you have that Vanilla Quake 3 movement in the air a little bit. Like, here, watch. I'm just going to do a nice circle strafe and then stop turning, and then I turn a little more and I gain some speed. Let me do that again. See? So this Vanilla Quake 3 air movement, people call it strafe jumping for some reason. I don't know why they picked that term. I don't agree or disagree with it, but I don't play Vanilla Quake 3 that much, so I don't worry about it. I just call everything air strafing. But if someone says air strafing, they're just talking about air movement in a 3D game where you can use the strafe keys to do it instead of having some weird vehicular system. And by vehicular system, I actually mean like a vehicle, like the parachute in Just Cause 2 or whatever, or the parachute in Team Fortress 2 or whatever. So that's different. I mean, you can still air strafe with that thing. I'm not going to get into all this, but air strafing is just like, you use your strafe keys somehow, and you can turn in the air, you can control yourself, it just does stuff. You can, like, change your direction. It's not a specific thing, but in this case, when I say air strafing here, I'm always referring to the Quake World style, in order to distinguish it from the Quake 3 style. Just an arbitrary distinction for the point of this video. So this is strafe jumping, and this is air strafing. So one of the things about air strafing is actually you can watch my movement keys, you can go like this. So you can strafe one way and then strafe the other way, and you don't lose a lot of speed. It's almost as fluid as just going like this in Vanilla Quake 3. And this is actually where the term strafe jumping, I think, came from, because you would do a circle jump with your strafe keys on the ground diagonally instead of doing it with forward. I don't know, it's just an idea. I don't know where the etymology of these words is, but I'm trying to make it so that you can remember them better, whoever's watching this video. I'm trying to help you understand more so you can, like, think about what the game is doing, what you should call it, how you should talk to people about it, and the better you understand the math or physics or feeling, the actual feeling behind what you're doing when you do these things, it's going to be much easier to improve when you practice, because you'll understand why you mess up or why you do well. And you might notice weird quirks about the game that you have to avoid, like, in TF2, when you jump off the ground, your velocity is always limited to 120% of your normal movement speed. So even if you're the best bunny hopper in the world, you're always limited to a little bit above, just because of the air strafing part, where you get more acceleration in the air. But because it keeps resetting it to 120% whenever you jump, even if it's frame perfect in TF2, bunny hopping isn't that strong. It's only useful for a couple things, like going across ledges like that. There's a couple things you can do on bad water like that, but they're really difficult because of the way that the game handles jumping. So in a normal arena shooter, you're just going to have something called queued jumping, where you, like, press the button over and over again. You don't have to press it exactly when you land. You just have to press it once. You can only jump one time each time you press it. That's why it's called queued. You queue up the single jump from that button press. And then there's pogo stick jumping, which is just like a pogo stick. You hold it down and you keep bouncing. You just bounce in a straight line. You can turn, you can do whatever. So, vanilla Quake 3 air strafing has a much higher acceleration, and it's a much straighter path than the Quake World kind. But the Quake World kind, you can round corners a lot more easily, because you can, of course, it's tighter. And it's hard for me not to lose speed in this game because it's Warsow instead of CPMA, but it's really, really easy to keep your speed without going around corners. Or with going around corners, you can keep your speed because you can turn tighter. So in Vanilla Quake 3 and Quake Live, whenever I go around corners at a high speed, I land on the ground and do a circle jump, and that might be a useful technique for someone to get used to. So it would be like that. But you don't lose as much speed in Quake Live because of the way friction acceleration work. It's all slightly different between all these games. You'll just have to practice and get used to it for yourself. So, circle jumping, nice, you get higher speeds to begin with, but circle jumping is limited because of the fact that the speed cap is actually static instead of going with you as you go. So when you go like this, it's like you're pulling yourself along and it goes with you as you go. But that's not how a circle strafe works. Circle strafes have a limit. They have an ideal speed of turning, and you can't go above however fast you can go in a game engine with a specific circle strafe speed. And some games with exactly the same code run at different internal frame rates and make it so that all bets are off. Like Counter-Strike 1.6, there was a point in the early days where you could circle strafe like this with your forward key, and it would work a little differently between competitive and public servers, because public servers had a low tick rate to reduce bandwidth and CPU costs, but competitive servers had a high tick rate because that made hit reg better, just slightly, because of the way that source engine lag compensation works. Stuff's like locked to your command frames and stuff. Don't worry about it. It's just those guys use higher tick rates because it's slightly better. It's a lot more intensive. But the thing is, when you change the tick rate like that, it changes the physics slightly. Like, take for example, just a simple jump. It's a parabola, right? No, nothing to worry about. But then you like graph a parabola with different points, and when a game has a frame rate, it has these points. These are the actual specific points in time that the game has actually simulated. Like, these are both parabolas. This one's really low resolution, that one's higher resolution. And this one goes higher because it happens to have a point right at the top. And this one goes lower because the top of the parabola is just straight between 2 points. So this was actually a problem in Vanilla Quake 3 before it got good lag compensation or a better input system. Because the movement ran at the client's frame rate. So if you had a frame rate of like 60 frames a second, you couldn't get up certain jumps because you didn't have that central vertex on the parabola of the jump arc. But with 125 FPS, you could get up slightly taller ledges, just like that, just because you had a slightly different frame rate. And that's just the way that it goes. Like, you can have, if you have a frame rate that works like that, you can have any multiple of it, and it'll have the same points, and it'll have more points in between. You don't have to worry about anything. 250 frames per second is what I play at in CPMA because it's just slightly less input laggy. It's like I go from 4 milliseconds average lag from the game engine to 2 milliseconds extra lag from the game engine. It's not a lot, but I can feel it ever so slightly just because the rest of my computer's a little laggy. It puts it below that threshold. So don't worry about having the exact frame rate either, because in the modern games, like in Counter-Strike, as I was talking about, it runs at the server's tick rate instead of the client's frame rate. All physics runs at the server tick rate, all of it. So if the server runs at 64 ticks, and it just so happens that that 64 tick arc is like this, and then you add in, oh well, let me make a better one, that's shit. So if the 64 tick arc is like this, and then 128 tick arc is going to be like this, and you have that higher point, you can make slightly taller jumps. And that's just the way that it works. That's just how simulating, it's all a bunch of discrete mathematics nonsense, but like, if you have a game engine, it's going to have those ticks, and it's going to have them at intervals of some kind. Even if that interval is identical as your frame rate, even if the interval changes over time, it's going to have intervals. Nothing is perfectly smooth, nothing. So you have these little, like, they're called temporal aliasing problems, but you can just think of it as the frame rate changes the physics. Of course, there's another kind, like the frame rate is actually tied to the physics, and having double the frame rate gives you double the physics. And there's another kind where the physics doesn't scale perfectly with the frame rate. Like, some stuff works slightly differently when you change the numbers because it's applied wrong. And I'll link a post in the description explaining some of that. I wrote it quite a while ago because I was working on a game where I had to change the frame rate of the game, and it changed a bunch of nasty stuff because of the way that everyone does things, and it's really bad, and you'll just have to read that to understand. And if you don't still understand about it, don't worry. Just remember, every game is different. Even if one game is perfectly fine at random frame rates, another might not be. One might have server tick rate stuff like any Source Engine game. And IO Quake 3, CPMA, and Quake Live all run inputs at a fixed rate, period. It's not the server tick rate. It's not the client frame rate. It's a fixed input command rate. It's 125 on all those games. 125 times a second, even if you're running at 20 FPS, even though the servers run at 20 frames per second, all the input is handled at 125 times a second so that they have these proper arcs, so that people can't get a disadvantage or an advantage by having different frame rates, or so that the physics doesn't change from server to server slightly. So in the case of air strafing like this all comes back to air strafing. Yes, it does. So in the case of air strafing like this, you actually have those games with the server-dependent physics. Because of the way that they scale the physics, they don't scale the acceleration properly because it hits that cap every single frame. Instead of hitting the cap like, oh, let's do this weird convoluted calculation every single frame. No, they're not gonna do that. That's way too hard. So even if they scale the acceleration properly, the fact that there is a hard cap right there means that different physics frame rates will change the rate at which you can turn. Because let me put it this way. So here you have this big triangle, and you can't pull it as far. So here you have this small triangle, but it happens twice as often, and you can pull it further because of the way that the cap works. So you can air strafe slightly tighter. And this is actually a problem that Counter-Strike Source and Counter-Strike Source trick jumping servers have. Like, the community is divided between using one of two different tick rates for the server, and they also have the opposite difference in the air acceleration value. So, like, it's not precisely the same because you have this weird scaling stuff and the math doesn't work out perfectly, but it's their approximation. Like, just for example, a 128 tick surf server, that's what they call that specific kind of trick jumping, is going to have half the air acceleration value per frame of a 64 tick server. And that's not just like, even though there's that cap there, it's still slightly tighter on a 128 tick server. That's why the math doesn't work out right. And like, because it's an arc that you're sampling, that's another reason the math doesn't work out perfectly. They're slightly different, but it's very similar. So don't worry about it. Just remember, every game is a little different. You have to do a little bit of research to fully understand the game you're going to play. But if you play CPMA, you don't have to worry about a thing, because it's all 125 tick inputs. It doesn't matter your frame rate, not the server. Everything works. So you got a circle jump. You can go like that. That's pretty smooth. You can see, watch my movement keys. I'm going to go like that and then go like that. That's one trick. And then there's another one, like, you can go like that and you just start out. You start out with the same keys. You don't have to worry about anything. That's how people normally circle jump too. They keep holding those keys, because watch my acceleration down the bottom. Dun dun dun. It keeps climbing for a moment. And another thing is CPMA has something called ramp jumps, and I'm not sure I can get it exactly right here, but that's a lot higher than a normal jump, right? So I'm not sure if I can get it to work properly here, because, yeah, that worked. That was a little higher than a normal jump. You see, I'm jumping from below the normal ground level, and I'm still going higher, because it's keeping my inertia as I go up the ramp. And another problem with CPMA, like, this is Quake 3 too, so I go up this, and I stick to it, and I go down it, I don't stick to it. In CPMA, if you go up something like that, you don't stick to it. That's why this happens. Like, it stuck me to the top, but then it lets go of me. That's a Warsow thing. Warsow sticks you to the flat plane when you hit the top. But CPMA doesn't stick you to anything. Neither does Vanilla Quake 3 or Quake World. Well, actually, I think Vanilla Quake 3 does. But in Vanilla Quake 3, you can't ramp jump because it sets your velocity instead of adding it. Like, CPMA and Quake World just assume that if you're on the ground, you're not moving vertically. Yeah, but then you're on a ramp you could jump on. So another thing is stairs. Like, when I go up the stair, it does a specific amount of movement, but when I go up it quickly, it smooths it. And one of the problems with that is, like, do I have a hit scan weapon that I can shoot with? God, this game doesn't have a machine gun. Wow. Okay, just, like, I'm going to shoot the wall as I go up this. So you can see that's not in the same center. Well, you should... What? Oh, I'm on the ramp, so it's not smoothing. Okay. Wow, this game is good. It doesn't bug out when you go up ramps like Source Engine does. Okay, so I'm going to go up this, go up the center. You can see my crosshair is slightly below the center of that shot the entire time, because it's smoothing out my vertical position slightly. So you'll have to remember that as you go up staircases in CPMA. You have to down aim slightly. It's a little more extreme in CPMA because of the specific values that they use. I went into the code, I made a mod, I changed it, just to make sure that I understood what I was doing. But yeah, so you have to worry about stairs. You don't stick to them when you go down them, you lose control. Like, right now I'm just stutter stepping, I'm losing control already. That's just a quirk of Quake 3. People don't want to change it for some reason, I don't know. So you can air strafe like this, you can make nice tight turns. Air strafe like this, you can go really fast. Strafe jumping, air strafing, strafe jumping, air strafing. You'll see Counter-Strike pros go like this because that's the kind they have in Counter-Strike. Remember that. You'll have to make sure that your specific game works the same way. And some games are just weird. Like in Morrowind, it's a first-person game, not a shooter, and it's single player. But when you jump, it has a jump velocity vector, and then you can also do a normal walking vector in the air. So you can hold forward and jump, and you're going twice as fast. Or you can, like, jump forward and then hold backward and you're air stalled. It's really weird. I mean, it's kind of interesting, but still. And then there's a game called Quake 2 World, Q2. They changed the name at some point. And they have Vanilla Quake 3 air movement, but the acceleration's really high and they have air friction. So, like, you can make tighter turns because the acceleration's higher, and you can make higher, longer jumps slightly more easily without putting as much time into it. But the speed cap there's more of a speed cap because there's friction. So you can't go as fast as high speed without putting a lot of effort into it. And you have to keep on, you have to keep on air strafing in that game to maintain your speed. Whereas here you can just, like, hey, look at me, I'm moving 400 units per second, everything's fine. And there's some games that sap your speed when you land. Not like setting your speed back to normal or making it really low, but they subtract just a little to make sure that people who are just jumping a straight line don't maintain their speed. I'm not sure what games do that, but some do. And for an example of a game that limits your speed when you go way too fast, Team Fortress Classic now. Pretty sure that's why it died. Don't ask me, though. And Black Mesa Source, if you land on the ground, you lose your speed. But if you get a frame-perfect jump in Black Mesa Source, you can keep bunny hopping and maintain all your speed. And in Team Fortress 2, whenever you jump, it's limited to 120, so it doesn't matter how frame-perfect you are, because it's not going to it doesn't matter that it registers that you're on the ground or not. It just registers you jumped and capping your horizontal speed. That's how TF2 works. And in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, it's like Black Mesa. You have to get a frame-perfect jump to keep bunny hopping. And also, in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, it also has the Team Fortress Classic thing at the same time. If you go above, like, 300-something units per second, I don't know, no, I think maybe it was 300, I don't remember. You'll have to look it up. But if you go too fast when you're bunny hopping in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, it'll actually sap your speed a lot. Like, it'll set you to 100 or something. And you'll see, like, accusations of people bunny hopping in Counter-Strike Global Offensive that they're using hacks instead of doing it manually. And the evidence that they use is that they have their speed cap in the air at a specific value, and they never get faster than that cap. Like, there was this guy that did it recently and claimed he wasn't hacking. It was just special server stuff. He was just, like, his friends set it up. And then, like, yeah, like, that's not shady to begin with when you're, like, misleading your viewers. But what kind of server plugin modifies the client's prediction speed? Like, when you're moving around in a game, it's all on the client, and this comes back to something I'm going to explain in a moment. So, it's all on the client side in a good modern game, because otherwise it would be feeling really, really laggy whenever you have a remotely high ping. Like, even 50 milliseconds of lag becomes unbearable if you're trying to shoot while moving, like stutter stepping or whatever, because everything starts going out of sync. Quake World, I don't think, has input prediction, but don't quote me on that. So, when this applies to air strafing, you can, like, have 125 frames per second, the server runs at 20 frames a second, and then the inputs are locked at 125 frames per second, like CPMA, and then you can, like, you're moving at 125 frames per second, and you run into a corner just like that. Like, you run into a corner like that, and you lose your speed on your client, but then all of a sudden it snaps it back into position, because on the server, it's only running at 125 frames per second. So, like, here's a corner on a wall, just pretend this is the wall, and this is your movement. And this is the outer corner of your movement box. Like, look at the tiles on the floor. That's the shape of the part of your body that games typically use for collision. Warsow is actually slightly different, handles things differently. Whoa, dude, Warsow has buggy friction. Okay, ignore that. So, at 20 frames a second, that corner is gonna skip the other corner, and you're gonna, like, teleport through the corner of the wall if you clip it just a little bit, even though on your client you got stopped by the wall, because the server never saw you hit the wall. And there are a couple of ways for game engines to avoid this, but Quake players like it, so they don't change it, because it means they can make slightly tighter turns without having to change their maps, or without having balance problems arising from smaller hitboxes. So you don't have to worry about that, just know that it's a thing, and, like, changing the server frame rate is going to change that, regardless of the game, because the server frame rate's the actual physics frame rate. So the reason that input physics works slightly differently is because they're, like, I'm not gonna get into it, but just remember that they're slightly different things. You just have to do your research, you have to practice, you have to understand what's going on. So, thank you for watching. I hope that I divulged enough historical information for this to stick in the brains of whoever's watching this, and hope you enjoyed.